Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the National Organization of Italian American Women and the Greater New York region of the National Organization. Tonight, we will learn a lot more about CIMA, the Center for International Modern Art, Italian Modern Art, excuse me. I have a message on my equipment. Let me just get rid of that. Okay. So let me tell you a little bit about Laura Mattioli. She is an esteemed NOIAW Wise Woman honoree and a woman of great vision. Mattioli is an art historian, curator, and collector. She specializes in 20th century Italian art and has published and lectured, and she has presented extensively on the subject. In 2013, she founded and became the president of the Center for Italian Modern Art, CIMA, which is a nonprofit exhibition and research center in New York dedicated to the study of Italian art. What ignited this vision? Mattioli says, from 1994, I began to travel every year in the United States with my family and the important Italian contemporary art collector, Giuseppe Panza di Biomo. We went to see museums, galleries, and artists. In the following years, I realized more and more how Italian modern art was not known and misunderstood in the United States and in general. It was misunderstood in the international world as well. Modern art came to the United States through France. Since 1983, Mattioli has been the curator responsible for the collection of her father, Gianni Mattioli. He was considered one of the most important aggregators of Italian avant-garde modern art and has a collection under his stewardship. These works are loaned to institutions throughout the world, including to the Penny Guggenheim collection in Venice. CIMA is located at 421 Broome Street, 4th floor. CIMA brings to us the works of Mario Schifano. I quote, "To say this exhibit facing America," I'm sorry, let me repeat that. I quote, "To say the exhibition facing America, Mario Schifano, 1960 to 65, is an eye-opener. It hardly does it justice." Boy, I really botched that quote, sorry. To learn more about Schifano, a leading figure in Italian post-war and contemporary art, we have with us today Asia Martin. It's my pleasure to introduce Asia, the 2021 Research Fellow at the Center for Italian Modern Art in New York City. She is a doctoral candidate in art history at Rice University, where she writes on 20th century art with an emphasis on works made in Italy. Her dissertation, Dark Matters, Lucio Fontana's Grotesque World, explores the conspicuous presence of shadows and voids which appear across Fontana's art in ways that create balance with light and space. Asia holds a master's degree in art history from the Meadows School of Art at Southern Methodist and has curated large-scale contemporary art exhibitions and served in a curatorial department and on select boards across Texas. Please join me in welcoming Asia.
Hi, everybody. I'm so glad to be here today with you. I want to thank Mary Rose and Charity for all of the communications thus far and for making sure that we're all squared away for our talk today. And as Charity just posted in the chat, as a sort of prompt, please feel free to chat or I'm sorry, to type any of your questions into the chat field, which if you just click on the chat bubble at the bottom of your screen, the window will open and you can enter your question or comments there. I love to be able to dialogue with you all, and I'm happy to try to address your questions and comments as we move through the work and through the show, as opposed to us waiting and holding everything until the end. I'd like to have a conversation with you all, if to whatever extent is possible here in our virtual format. All right. So I'm going to share my screen, and you all should still have the ability to enter questions and things in the chat function. Share, and let me just make one adjustment. Let's go into presentation mode. Here we are. Okay. So you're looking at a photograph of the beautiful site where Chima is located, also on the traditional Munsee Lenape territory of Soho and Manhattan. We're on the 4th floor, and you know, Soho is known for its beautiful cast iron architecture, sort of world renowned for that kind of architecture. And this is a beautiful example of which. And so as Mary Rose was kind of explaining, I'd like to sort of further her description of Laura's program. She chose a residential space very intentionally and wanted to be able to share works of art with people, with the community, in the same manner in which her father did. And so you'll notice inside the gallery, it's beautifully designed with a lot of features that you would see in a home, like the fireplace, the coffee table, and each object within the space has been curated by the founder. There have even been articles about the design of the place. For example, the 2 chairs you see here by Gio Ponti, as well as the coffee table, I believe. And there are other designers featured around the space. But the idea is that when you visit the center, you can come and sit in the chairs, you know, visit with a friend and sit and live amongst the work to a certain extent, and really take your time and not feel, you know, the pressure that you would at a kind of more traditional museum space. So in a lot of ways, Laura is able to keep the sort of salon tradition a lot that her father created in Milan alive, also in Manhattan. So the exhibition that we'll be visiting today is called Facing America, Mario Schifano from 1960 to 1965. And the show is curated by actually a former fellow of Cima, Francesco Guzzetti, who is now with the Morgan Library, among other institutions. I believe he's also a professor these days. And he will actually be at the fall event at the gallery on Wednesday night, I believe. And tickets are available to that. And of course, all of our events are free to members. So if you're not a member, please consider joining. They offer a lot of great programming, especially now that we're all sort of back in person. It's a really great experience to be in the space. And so the exhibition, I'd like to begin by sort of showing you the kitchen area, which I realized photographs very coldly and very austere compared to the actual feel of the space. Nonetheless, what we have on display here are a selection of photographs that Mario took during his first visit to the US, which was at the end of 1963. In December, and he stayed here until July. And he was in New York, in Manhattan most of the time. He did take a road trip with poet Frank O'Hara, who we will see some works later that they worked on together or that they created together. But what I think is important about the sort of kitchen display area and the works on the walls are that through the photography, you can see Mario has a very particular sort of non-traditional approach to photography. And of course, we can't get in and get tight with the images like we would be able to in the gallery, but you can notice that many of the images are tilted at an angle or not shot straight on. And so he really is playing with the photographic frame and, you know, the little square that we used to have to look through to take a photo, as opposed to just holding our phones up and clicking the button. We also, on display in the kitchen, have several of the videos that he shot. He shot 8mm film videos on a road trip, and actually the piece is called Road Trip, on the jaunt that he and Frank O'Hara took down to Mexico. And so that film also shows him constantly sort of rotating the camera over and back and really trying to take in the world in kind of altered states. So that just sort of sets up his trip to New York. And in New York is when he really started to do these kinds of investigations with photography and with video, things that would later become very, very important in his practice. And he was born in 1934 in Homs, Libya, actually, to two Italian parents, nonetheless. And then when he was a young child, after World War II, Schifano moved back to Italy. And I shouldn't say moved, it was by force, because Italy was forced by the Treaty of Paris to give up all of its colonial territories along the Horn of Africa and the rest of the Mediterranean. And Libya was one of those places. And so anyone who was Italian was brought back to the mainland, for example, per se. And so he actually lived with his brother and sister and his mother in a refugee camp. And a little known fact is that the famous Cinecittà studios in Rome were actually converted into a refugee camp at the end of the Second World War. And the site was divided between America and Italy. And so Americans sort of facilitated the processing of refugees who weren't Italian, and the Italian government worked with reintegrating their own citizens back into Italy. At a certain point, Schifano's father came back to Italy and they resettled in Rome. And that is when Schifano really sort of took an interest in art. He had a sort of troubled life and didn't do too well in school, but he did have this knack for art. And so periodically he would have a tutor that he would work with on drawing and on painting. And so before we actually, now I've given you some of the biography and shown you some of the context of New York, I would love to do kind of a video walkthrough so that you can have a better understanding of the space, how it's laid out, and the kind of order that will go through the work in the show. So I'm going to press play here. And so this is when you step off the elevator, you will see the kitchen in front of you. And so this is the area that I was just showing you the very cold photograph of. But then you have this corridor. This corridor really sort of sets up the dialogue. It shows a lot of the works that Schifano would have known or would have been looking at, and the artists he would have been dialoguing with in America, since that's what the show kind of centers on, Mario looking at America, coming here, and then going back. Here's our North Gallery, where you'll see the monochromes and the works that deal with the sort of Ileana Sonaben chapter of his life. Then over here on this side, you'll see more of the figurative works. And so the span of the show is only 5 years, but what you'll notice is that he explores many different mediums and modes of painting in that short period of time. And this is where we sit, the fellows. And then through the hall, back to the hallway, this is the Words and Drawing series that Mario created with Schifano, I'm sorry, with Frank O'Hara during his time in New York. and it's 17 drawings. They're quite poignant. I actually presented my research on those drawings a few weeks ago at our study days event. And then here in this last corridor, just show some of the work that he would create after his time in America. All right. So moving on to our show. Okay, so here are a selection of works by Jasper Johns and Robert Rauschenberg. And so you're seeing in the vitrine early works by Rauschenberg from the 1950s, the early 1950s, actually 1952. And so one of the great things about the space is that we do consider ourselves to be a research center. And so one of the things that came out of the exhibition, and these works specifically being exhibited, the ones in the vitrine, is that the conservator from the Rauschenberg estate came over and actually corrected the date that the collector had. The collector and the gallerist who sold these works to that collector thought the pieces were from the 60s, and they're actually can be tracked to the 50s, to 52 specifically. And so these are the kinds of things, I mean, that's a small example, but those are the kinds of things that come out of these exhibitions. It's not just showing the work, it's also sort of, it's very much so creating scholarship from the exhibition. And so you'll see here collage. And I think that's what Francesco thought was most important to kind of communicate, was that this idea of collage and the sort of bare requirements for a painting are things that Rauschenberg is looking at in this moment. We also have an example above on the left, the small gray work, which is actually a Jasper Johns piece, which has a number of numbers painted on it. And so artists are really investigating what is kind of the minimum requirement of an art object. These are for large part found materials. They're just pieces of paper cut and glued, sometimes painted, but oftentimes just paper pasted onto, for example, cardboard. And do these things still function as paintings, I think, is what the artists were asking. So in dialogue with the Rauschenberg collages across on the wall across from them, you'll see these small works on paper by Schifano on the right-hand side. And he's using his traditional enamel medium, which is something that he carries throughout his process, throughout his practice. And then on the left, you'll see a work by Jim Dine, which actually has a physical zipper. Perhaps I have an image of that one, a close-up, yes. So you have a physical zipper, and this piece is kind of playing on Barnett Newman's zips, or his canvases that look very much like this, however, just paint with a different color or a blank field left down the center of the canvas. These are this is a larger sort of blow up of some of the works that Schifano made, and that we think, or that Francesco thinks, dialogue very much with the other works that it's surrounded by. And we can't really think of these works as studies because they really do kind of stand on their own. One detail I'll point out now is that you notice he writes Coca-Cola above this red monochrome, and he spells it with K's. And that was meant as a kind of offensive. Anytime you see America spelled with a K, that is typically a European writing that, and it's meant to be a sort of derogatory way of referring to America, substituting the C with a K. And so he does that same sort of wordplay with Coca-Cola, and later we'll see works that show you more of his sort of attitude toward American products, and perhaps toward America in general. So moving along out of that first corridor, we're in the North Gallery here, and you'll see very early work. The first piece on the left, which I have a detail of, is titled Pittura. And this is a really tight crop, unfortunately, of the image, because if it were a full image, you'd be able to see that this is actually really heavy concrete that's been poured onto a really rough, roughly woven, darker brown thread canvas. And you can make out that canvas support around the edge of the piece. But from what we have here, you can see this work definitely matches with a lot of the sort of informal art that was going on in Paris just after the war, from the late 40s into the 50s. And it's this very expressive mode, very gestural, very material. Artists were sort of asking themselves, what could you even paint after the horror of the world, of the wars and the death that took place? And just the widespread violence that sort of encompassed our globe in that moment. And so it was a very kind of existential moment. And I would say that you can definitely relate this kind of French informal art, which in Italy was known as informale, to the abstract expressionists, Jackson Pollock, de Kooning, and these artists who were also being very expressive on the canvas, albeit with paint and brushes and dripping and these sorts of things. And the piece next to the pittura, or painting in Italian, it's pittura is painting in Italian, is this other fabulous monochrome dedicated to Di Chirico. And what you'll notice about this work, going back to the works we saw in the front area, the collages, is that the artist actually takes individual sheets of paper, which you can make out if you have your screen maximized. You can see there's a very subtle grid structure behind the gray. And those are individual sheets of paper the artist painted in this very thick enamel paint, and then glued those painted papers to the surface of the canvas. And then went in and further painted the white sort of border that you see working around. And I should point out that, like the abstract expressionists, like a lot of the informal and informale painters, Mario painted his paintings down on the ground. He would actually stand above them with the canvas on the floor and layer his materials on and dip his papers and apply them. And then he would put them up on the wall. And we actually don't know if the drip comes only from gravity dragging the paint down, or if he was actually putting those drips in almost by hand or by, through some other implement while the pieces were flat. But you'll see the sagging and the creasing. The work is very frontal. And I want to go back to the larger image. You can see the detail, how he's really in there with the paint. It's not a kind of Rothko moment or an Yves Klein moment where you're supposed to be carried away and have this kind of transcendental experience. It's much more about the materiality of the paint, and it's sitting on the surface and really not even sitting in the surface of the canvas, sitting on top of the canvas. And in that sense, kind of more in our space than within the warp and the weft. And I think that's really important. And so something I want to point out here as well is that by the early 60s, when he's creating the monochrome pieces that you see, so eliminating the first work on your left and looking at all of the others, the monochrome as a way of painting was already established. Malevich had painted the first monochrome actually in 1915. So we have 45, 47 years we're looking at where the monochrome had been a thing already. So when you look at the other works behind us, which I'll show you in just a moment, which have to do with appropriation and with taking pre-existing images, we may consider that even these are pre-existing images, the monochrome. The monochrome is already a very established program. But what is distinct about Schifano's beyond the kind of materiality is the shape. And at this moment, I like to ask the audience and those on the tour if they have any kind of response to the kind of border type form and shape of the works, if they read that as anything in particular. And feel free to type your ideas in the chat. You could even unmute yourself and just sort of blurt out any kind of ideas you have about that particular form. Okay, so I'll throw out some of the ideas I've considered. I think something that definitely became, that we've already talked about, for one, is the photographic viewfinder, the photographic frame, and the idea of looking through these frames and seeing the world in a series of strict and delineated moments. But also, television was really, really on the uptick at this moment. And in a lot of ways, televisions worked to kind of unite a still kind of disparate group of Italian cultures across the peninsula. It's a way also for America and our government here to try to influence and sway and massage the Italian population to sort of come over to, the Allies side and away from the Axis side. Communism was still very, very strong in Italy, even after the war. And so America had a really big job to do, they thought, culturally. And so the culture war continued beyond the actual military front of the World War. And so here, another set of monochromes, and it's unfortunate you could barely make it out here, but these canvases are all very sculptural. They have shape to them. They have a kind of a form and a kind of body. So not only do they have the kind of undergirding structure of the papers that have been painted and applied to the surfaces, which you can see here in the faint lines, but also they have a curve to them, and they kind of curve toward the viewer. And they almost read as, crucifixion forms or emaciated bodies or just skin, and just they give you that sort of a kind of a bodiness that is very visceral in person, and that you just don't see. You can really make it out here, where you see the sort of edges kind of bending out. Here's another example. And so here you see stenciled numbers and letters, which refer back to the Jasper Johns piece that was hanging in the sort of entry area. But you'll also see the sort of cut and the stitch that references Alberto Burri, another really significant artist from the 50s, who made these kind of collaged works where he would stitch burlap and found surfaces together to organize a kind of canvas-like structure. And those are often likened to the body, and especially because Burri was actually a surgeon before he was a prisoner of war in Texas, and ended up sort of maybe therapeutically creating his way of creating art. He became an artist full-time after his war experience. And there's just a sort of a more distanced view of the number 3 piece, one of my favorite works in the show. And so these are just to the right of the monochromes we were looking at. And you'll see 2 works that are named after jazz songs. On the left, the red monochrome, which again has that sort of framed view, is it's titled Something Else, which is a jazz tune by Cannonball Adderley and Miles Davis, where they it's like a dueling banjos kind of song. It's a beautiful tune if you have time to look it up and give it a listen. And there's also a piece, the yellow work, that's divided symmetrically down the center, is called Venus de Milo. And that is actually also the title of a jazz song. But what I love about that title is that clearly we all know Venus de Milo is a famous Renaissance painting. And so you see something that's a very important Italian cultural object making the journey to America, where it then takes on a new added significance because Miles Davis's use of that title of the painting for an American jazz song. But then you have an Italian artist coming and kind of bringing it back into the Italian context, which I love, just the dynamism and the ongoing relationship between Italy and America. And that's part of why I even chose to work with Italian modernism, is that Italy is just such a dynamic region and has these wonderful relationships with other places. And so it allows me to study lots of different places, even while my focus is on Italy. And above the mantle, we have a piece called Indicazione. And one thing I did not mention is that the monochromes are the works that Ileana Sonnabend, a very famous gallerist in America, latched onto. So they did a show together in 1962. However, very quickly, Schifano moves on to starting to incorporate things in his work, imagery, content, like the arrow. And you can't make it out, you can barely make it out here, but it says indicazione at the bottom left of the piece on our left. Then you have the sort of detail of the Coca-Cola logo in the next piece. And then you see this portrait of Leonardo da Vinci, which was actually taken from commemorative dollars and commemorative currency and the commemorative calendar. So what's common amongst these images is this idea of the pre-existing image. So like the monochrome may have been pre-existing image for Schifano, so too were these cultural images. And the propaganda piece in particular has a kind of resonance. So by naming the work Grande Particolare di Propaganda, he's saying very clearly he finds the Coca-Cola logo to be a kind of propaganda. And he sees very clearly what's going on, you know, with the Bretton Woods plan and the Marshall Plan and the Fulbright plan. There was a way that the US was kind of seeking to be the big brother to Italy and to sort of bring over our kind of cultural values, and that includes our iconography, to Italy, for good or for bad. And so this Time Life magazine cover that I found from 1950, I thought really kind of got at and explained and visualizes Schifano's idea about Coca-Cola, and even the kinds of billboards and signs that are appearing all throughout the landscape in Italy and in France and Germany as well. And so you'll notice the red paint here on the canvas it's very sticky. It looks sticky, it drips. You'll notice that tiny little slice in the A where the red paint kind of drips out as if it's a cut. And in person, there's no denying that this red is intended to look kind of like a kind of oxygenated blood, or like blood that's drying up. And it does give you the sense that perhaps Schifano is not necessarily thrilled about, cultural imperialism as it is known. And so moving on, here we have an example. See, he's taken this image of Leonardo from something that's pre-existing and carried it over into the painterly, the fine art realm. And he's also stenciled Leonardo at the very top of the work. The piece is divided in half, as he was known to do. And that disallows you from seeing it as a true portrait. It's meant to sort of jar us out of that kind of, casual illusionistic viewership that we might take in a Renoir or a Van Gogh. It is meant, Van Gogh is a bad example because he was very much about paint also. But this is about the kind of materiality of the object, as opposed to allowing you to sort of contemplate the artist like you can even in some of these pre-existing images, the stamp and the dollar. Leonardo looks pensive and you get a feel for him. Whereas in the painting on the left, it's really about the image and the image being transferred over and kind of crudely applied. Also here with this piece en plein air, it's kind of it's kind of a joke because in the bottom right-hand corner, you'll see this is the image that Schifano borrowed from to create the large-scale painting. And the image is actually a magazine ad. So it's anything but en plein air or natural. En plein air is what the Impressionists referred to as their process for painting outside. Well, this isn't outside. Mario has taken a magazine page, ripped it out, and then converted it over to a canvas without ever setting foot in nature. Oops. And so this sort of third section of the exhibition has to do with his dialogue and his collaborative work with the poet, very famous poet known for inspiring the beat movement, Frank O'Hara. And so when Schifano moved here, he came across on the Colombo ship with his girlfriend at the time, Anita Pallenberg, someone who became, I think today we would call her an influencer, perhaps. She was a socialite. She was a very successful model, but she also ran with very famous people. So after dating Schifano, she was a partner and traveled with the Rolling Stones. She was the partner of Mick Jagger and traveled with the Rolling Stones for a period of time. But before any of that, she had met Mario in Rome and traveled here to the States with him. They stayed, first when they arrived here in December, they stayed with Anita's uncle, who they described as very conservative, and it wasn't very comfortable for them to be with him. They wanted to be with the, artsy, creative set and scene. And, with Mario being an artist, that makes sense. They want to be around other creative types. Not living with, Anita's uncle. So he lucked out and found a studio at 791 Broadway. And 791 Broadway was just so important because, as you'll see in one of the works that I'll show, this piece on the top right sort of notes a lot of the figures who were in and out of this building. And so Mario and Anita moved into what had been Lee Krasner's studio where she was teaching ballet. And Lee Krasner was, of course, a very, very significant abstract expressionist artist herself. But Jasper Johns lived upstairs from Mario and Anita at this time, and Frank O'Hara lived downstairs. So the place was just, always just, we call it lit. That's what we say today. We call it was lit. There were always people there. There were always parties going on. There was always sort of creation. There were always people taking photographs, and just really it's the beginning of this kind of communal culture, which was also very much the case in Rome. The 50s and the 60s, in fact, in Rome were very dynamic. You had a lot of ABX artists, actually, as well as other kinds of artists moving to Rome in the 50s. And so there was already a dialogue between the American and the Italian artists that had been established in the 50s. And of course, Italy has always been a destination for artists for hundreds and hundreds of years. But after the war, this was really a kind of acute phenomenon. Coming back to New York in the mid-60s, you'll see these are some of the figures who were in and out of the studio spaces where they all lived. Something else to note is this work, for example. Something I like about this particular series is that the poetry is in the handwriting of Frank O'Hara, but all of the images are drawn by Mario Schifano. And I think that coming back to that idea of vision, what I love about this series of pages that are meant to be viewed kind of like a book, you turn one page over and there's another page behind it, is that Schifano he hints at that. He reiterates the idea of the page, not only as something that he uses to build up his canvases, But as they would function here, the page is in a kind of book or in a series of images. And so what you notice on this page is that you have text, but you also have a stack of 1, 2, 3, 4 or more pages that seem to fan out into the back, into the space, the depth of the page itself. You also have the stenciled word liar, but it sits on an axis, an XY axis. And when you zoom in, maybe I did a detail. No, I did not. But you can see here that liar is in black on the right side of the axis, but it's in a darker gray on the left side. And so essentially what you're seeing is the page turn. You're seeing the functionality of the page and of the series of drawings kind of reiterated and spelled out for you within a single page. And I really love that. I really love that he seems to always be looking at how vision operates in different contexts. Here we have more lines of poetry, and we have what should be really recognizable as a kind of futuristic take on the human form. We should think of Giacomo Balla and his piece, A Girl Running on a Balcony, which is his daughter. But just like you have Balla doing a study of motion and vision, you have Schifano many years later, about 50, looking at motion, but perhaps less a scientific study of motion and more capturing the urban crowd, which was also another subject of the futurists. It's lesser discussed, but the futurists were definitely very concerned with like harnessing the energy of the crowd and depicting the crowd. And you'll see that throughout a lot of their work. Another important subject that comes up in the Words and Drawings series, despite Frank O'Hara's tendency to avoid subjects that have to do with politics, he is commenting on the assassination of JFK that took place only weeks before Schifano actually arrived in New York. So this piece, Dallas, or this page, Dallas, the words at the top form an acrostic poem. And an acrostic is when you have a word and then you have other words that branch off of that word downward. And so once again, you have the kind of the ways that you would see are articulated on the page with the arrow that shoots to the right and then shoots down the page, just like our reading direction works with the poem at the top, which reads Dallas, death, avarice, lust, laziness, ambivalence, stupidity. And then at the bottom, you have cupidity. And these read like, you know, kind of vices or deadly sins. It's, for me, most definitely a kind of commemorative portrait, because again, you have the frame monochrome, but here it starts to take on qualities of maybe a windshield. We know that JFK was in a convertible car when he was assassinated. The arrows start to look like the path he took through Dealey Plaza, making the right, coming down the road. And finally, this idea of body comes back here, sadly so, when we see the kind of loss that the monochromatic frame suffers at the top right edge. And so between the red splatter across the page, the loss at the monochrome, and then if you can make out between the two arrows in the top right corner, you have these 3 marks, which speak to the shots fired. You end up with a kind of portrait, a portrait of JFK's last day, his last moments, which is really sad and very poignant and very moving. I'm from Texas. I got my master's at SMU in Dallas, and I drove through Dealey Plaza every day And there isn't a day that you drive through there and don't think about this moment. And so this piece is definitely, it resonates and it touches me. And I wasn't alive at that time, but I can only imagine how thick the air must have been when Schifano arrived here in December of '63. And so at this point, I like to kind of draw a comparison to Andy Warhol, because Mario Schifano is known as the sort of head figure, though he would hate that, the head figure of the Scuola di Piazza del Popolo. And the Piazza del Popolo is known as basically the Italian version of pop. And so Warhol was a huge American pop artist. And so this is the kind of work that Eliana was showing. And so she didn't need an Italian artist also making pop art. She had all of these American artists making pop art, and she was selling their work and doing very well. And we think that was part of their relationship breaking down. But where you see Warhol giving us a true image of the figure, and this piece is so iconic, and you have, it's Marilyn diptych, and you have, it almost shows us the kind of violence of the repetition of her image and what celebrity can do. And you see, to me, the black and white half of the image is most poignant, because you see her image kind of affected by the medium that it's being conveyed through. And Warhol, of course, he's happy to keep this image where the registers are each different, and you can see the black ink kind of doing its own kind of damage. But by the end, by the fifth register, it's a very faint, ghostly impression of her, not the true Marilyn we may think of as more of the color image, or even the very top left first impression on the black and white series. And so Schifano and Warhol both picture American celebrity, but in very different ways, but both within media that really speak to the moment. You know, it could be said that the television, which was so suited to JFK, and so, which was such a boon to his popularity, and really worked with him, whereas it didn't feature Nixon's, you know, it didn't do any favors to Nixon, I should say, as far as his appearance. But the TV worked with Kennedy's kind of shaggy self, his, you know, thick tuft of hair and whatnot. And it popularized him, but it also maybe led to his downfall, just like celebrity could have perhaps led to Marilyn Monroe's downfall. And certainly the figures, not certainly, and we like to think of these figures as, you know, intertwined, but unfortunately suffering, you know, sad demises. And here we have another piece where you see him repeat this idea of the page, on the page, but it talks about Italian and American culture coming together again, because the poet Manzoni had died, and the Italian poet Manzoni, he died, and Verdi's Requiem, Verdi, excuse me, you know, when you grow up saying Italian words in English, you have to make those adjustments once you learn Italian to go back and correct those things. But so Verdi, this is a commentary on why Verdi's Requiem was played at Kennedy's funeral. And so again, you have kind of Italian and American culture coming together on these pages. And with vision in mind, again, you note that these are not a scientific repetition of the same figure. These are mourners whose heads, which are tilted down, you know, show you the gaze of mourning. And so vision is, I think always at play and always being worked through with Schifano. And here another image, this is just a blow up of some of the figures. Anita Pallenberg, Larry Rivers, Jasper Johns is noted. America is even listed in the center as a kind of figure. Who else do we have? Tano Festa, another famous Italian artist, who we think is the one who actually gave Schifano a book that discussed the futurists while he was here in the States. And so that's a very interesting turning point, is that while he's in America, he sort of discovers these Italian avant-garde, or rediscovers these Italian avant-garde motifs and figures that he starts to give a lot more attention to once he gets back to Italy. So it's almost like, to move away, you can kind of look back at home afresh or anew. And so finally, we see the last quadrant or gallery of work, which are all works he would create after he went back to Italy. You see the futurists still at play. You see he's continuing to do the kinds of Coca-Cola logos. I like to think of these as a kind of disegno or a kind of cartoon, and referencing, Renaissance Italian artists, the importance of drawing and sketching before painting. And then finally, he commemorates the first spacewalk by an American astronaut, which was on the cover of Time magazine also. And this piece, I really love it because it's one of the only works, or it's the only work in the show, where you get the feeling that the sort of rounded frame that he puts everywhere has something to do maybe with even riding on the tram. It's known that a lot of these artists were kind of living on the periphery and would take the tram into the center, the city center, where they would meet at Cafe Rosati and have cafe and talk, and they'd meet up with poets and filmmakers, and it was a very collegial and creative environment that they all kind of enjoyed. And so in conclusion, I just want to mention that our next exhibition is titled Staging Injustice, Italian Art from 1880 to 1917. And clearly that show wants to participate in a very contemporary discussion and show how Italy, went through also its own kinds of periods of turmoil, perhaps, maybe not the same as today, but turmoil no less. And so that show will open on January 25th. We'll be busy hanging it and mounting everything in December and early January. And we really look forward to and can't wait to welcome you into the space, should you be able to join us. And the show will be up until June. And I'll say that from now on, the center will actually mount 2 exhibitions per year, as opposed to the annual shows that we were doing. So I hope you all will visit. And at this point, I would love to have questions, comments. If anyone has any, I can take us out of screen share, or I am happy to show another image again. If anyone wants me to go back to an image, yes. Oh, you're muted.
I was I guess, I don't know how to say, emotionally taken back by his depiction, Dallas, and what, it really, it caused me to emote a great deal internally. And what I was matching it to, and now I have a different understanding of, is rap in this century. Because if you followed the words, the poetry, it was a rap type poetry that told a story, I think, of Camelot. Because that final word, cupidity, I just kept on saying cupidity, and I realized shattered Camelot. That's how I felt about that, shattered Camelot. I try very hard to understand abstract expressionism for various different reasons, not necessarily for just visual reasons, because some people feel very empty with visual art that is totally black. Even if you go forward and you try to look and say what's behind the black,
Right.
was the intention of the black. So when you brought out the fact that there was a lot of deep thought and reflection that he used before he created these abstractions, I thank you for that, because I'm an artist, and I don't have that level of appreciation of these kinds of works, but it gives me something new to think about. I add Reinhardt. Does that sound familiar
Oh,
to you?
absolutely. Yes.
Well,
Yes.
I studied with him.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, when I was in art school, they brought him in to the art class, and it was outside and plein air. And he was explaining his paintings to us before we went to MoMA to see them. And he often said they were empty. They were black, they were empty. But if you really looked inside of them and very, very carefully, you could maybe see something. But they were static, very static. And final thing, and I'll shut up and I'll let somebody else talk. I was looking at a lot of static visual art other than Dallas. That was, to me, a message. But all of a sudden he goes back to America, he goes back to Italy, and he continues painting in abstract expressionism. And all of a sudden I see movement in his works. There they are on that left side. I see that he went from very static and just static art into now playing more with form and shape and movement. And he's actually got some electricity going on in those works. That's my visualization and my feelings about them.
That's really wonderful, Mary Rose. You touch on a lot of really important points that I didn't get to bring up. And one, when you talk about rap, music, Frank O'Hara was a pianist. He was a classically trained pianist. He actually went to Harvard for piano and stopped doing music and moved into English and became a poet. And something he's known for is he loved to listen to the cadences of people's speech. And he would oftentimes try to emulate that with the way he would arrange words on the page, the kinds of gaps he would put between them, or where he would put a line break. And so when you talk about rap, I mean, I'm of course like just thinking about the musicality of his poetry. And so I think that's a really, really wonderful comment that you've made. Also, when you talk about movement, at a certain point, Mario sets up a grid of televisions in his home at his studio. And he has all of these TVs on, and he's just taking in the images. And so movement was something that was so important to him, even when it was about in real time and in real space. He loved going to clubs and being around dancing and seeing bodies in movement. And so, yeah, you're exactly right. And I think that futurism really appealed to him for those reasons. And yeah, I think you're
this is Betty speaking. Can you hear me? Hi. Thank you so much. This was wonderful. I agree with Mary Rose. I had the same kind of strong reaction to the Dallas thing. But what struck me is it seemed like there was a lot of Spanish influence, and maybe they're just like bullfighting. It struck me almost like, do you think there was any of that?
I have not read about any Spanish influence with Schifano in particular.
Just that some of the paintings just struck me as a little bit toward the ones at the end just looked to me like bullfighting, and I even the blood in Dallas made me think of a bull. Anyway, and so it just the kind of almost like violence that you might see in some.
I think you're right about that. If you look at a lot of his body of work, there is such a prevalence of red And I think it has different meanings at different times, but I think it all very oftentimes comes back to the body and to blood and to violence and this just red as, you know, rage or, but it's also a color for him to illustrate his affiliation with communism at a certain point. And so I think it takes on different meanings, but this idea of violence and cutting and a kind of chaos are very much, I think, a part of the larger body of work.
So I didn't catch this, but you may have said it, but what part of Italy was he from? And did he go back to the same part of Italy?
Rome, yes, and he did.
He's from
Rome. Mm-hmm.
He's went to Rome.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. It was really beautiful.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. It was my pleasure.
Anybody else have questions or comments? I'm sure Mary Rose can keep talking to you most of the night on this, right? Mary Rose?
Oh, you're muted.
Oh, was she muted?
Yes. Okay, I'm unmuted. I guess it mutes by itself. I was going to ask Asia, what do you think, Asia? Shall we call it a wrap?
I guess so. I mean, yeah, if there aren't any other questions, yeah, please. And if any of you are in the New York area and you want to come out, we are having the exhibition closes this week. So Saturday is our last day. So come out if you can, if you'd like to see these things in person and say hi, I'll be there.
Let me put the, I guess, closure on this beautiful, beautiful presentation, Asia, and the in-depth studying that you've done about the art, the period, etc. You know, many of us have lived through this time, and it comes very alive in your young mind and your understanding of it. Back in the 60s, I recall that a lot of us had a very laissez-faire attitude. Life was just grand, and we weren't paying attention to anything until JFK was shot. But you know, you brought it all together and into those moments, and and you're so young, and I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much.
I do want to thank other people that helped to make this event possible. And firstly, I'd like to say thank you to Phyllis Broughton, who brought everyone together around the table. From Chima, she worked with Nicola Lucci and Julia Lombardo. And also with Charity, I think we have a good team between Phyllis and Charity and Asia. They all just seem to blend together so wonderfully. So a shout out to all of them, great appreciation to all of you, and we look forward to more events with Chima in the future.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.